I think we need to get into the biggest news story of the year, the final college football rankings. Took all season, but we finally got to a real ranking show, Selection Sunday, this past Sunday. The only one that mattered. Everything prior to that was a complete fabrication, just for pure entertainment, clickbait, to sell some ads. All of it was meaningless until Sunday, and we got our final rankings, and I don't think anyone was too terribly surprised with the final four ended up being. Maybe the order in which they were
called it
placed.
perfectly.
Yeah,
it's captured on Twitter.
I've seen it. Many have seen it. Yeah, so Bama, after really beating the fuck out of Georgia in the SEC championship game, took over the number one slot, jumping up from number 3, jumping right over Michigan. That was a bit of a surprise, maybe. Clearly not to you, but there's an argument to be made for Michigan, who easily handled Iowa in an embarrassing Big Ten championship game, where somehow Kurt Ferentz and the Hawkeyes thought they could punt Michigan to death, and that did not work out so well, as Michigan just trounced them essentially. So you can make an argument where Michigan would be the number one team, having been number 2 the previous week. I guess I'm not surprised that Alabama gets favorable treatment from the committee, because we've seen that over and over and over again. Georgia drops to number 3, essentially, just so we don't have to see the rematch for the first round. We might see it in the championship, of course, but I think that was they say they don't do those things, for matchup reasons, but we know what's going on. Cincinnati, number 4, the first group of 5 school to ever make the playoff, which is momentous. Not surprising, considering they are undefeated, the only undefeated team in the country. If we want to talk about our rankings, I think ours would be fairly similar, except, we've had Cincinnati and Georgia number 1 and number 2 for many weeks, because they were the only undefeated teams left. So I think by logic, we'd have to move Cincinnati to number 1, since they won their game, and now they're the only undefeated team left in the country. Is that where your head was at for our final ranking?
I had, I went Cincy 1, Michigan 2.
Yep.
Bama 3, Georgia 4, Notre Dame 5.
Yeah.
And then Michigan State 6.
Wow. I think after what Baylor did, Baylor winning the Big 12 championship over, really Oklahoma State was going to be had a chance to make the real playoff with the number 4 ranking, possibly, if they had won that. They came an inch short, basically. Were you watching the Big 12 championship? That was a fun game. That was probably the best game of Saturday by far. I was going to move Baylor to number 6. I was definitely going to have Notre Dame to number 5. I was going to put Baylor in. I didn't think of Michigan State, just because they didn't even play in a championship game. They would have the same record as Baylor, I guess. No, Baylor would have one more win. They finished 11-2, or State's 10-2. I appreciate the generosity of you throw my team in there, which would be good.
They beat the number 2 team in the country.
That's true. That is true. Which would
no one else has that on their resume.
Which would also be my favorite thing of the playoff of this season. I'm actually, we are united by our hatred for University of Michigan football, but I think the fucking funniest thing that could possibly happen is if Michigan actually somehow won the national championship this year, and yet Spartan fans could hold it over their head for all time that, we beat you that year. So what does that really mean?
Whoop-de-doo.
I think it'd be so great for them to finally have that, and Spartan fans would just always have it hanging over their head.
I don't think I would. Nah, I'm good with Michigan not winning anything else for the rest of the year.
It's a double-edged sword right there. But So yeah, I guess our final ranking.
I'm fine with Baylor too. I was like, why not put MSU 6? They beat the number 2 team in the country.
I think it'd be hard to put Michigan State ahead of Ohio State if they have the same records, both 10-2, and Ohio State beat the
Mm.
fuck out of Michigan State. So, and I
And
don't
then
want to
Michigan beat the fuck out of Ohio State. It's all like it's all
the transitive property.
yeah, it's all and who did what later? I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
I again,
Fuck Ohio State.
yeah, Ohio State's not making our top six.
Let's just remove my suggestion and go with Baylor and call it a day.
Yeah, that's that's where I was going to go with it. I think, and I think that's fair. I think the whole point we've called this a limp six all year, and instead of doing our top 10 every week or top 25 every week, which would take hours. Six is a good number, but mainly because we're proponents of, or at least I am. I think you've joined aboard the 6-team playoff ship. I kind of really enjoy the 4-team playoff, but I know people want more. I just don't want it to expand. 8 would be the extreme limit, but people are talking about a 12.
Yeah, they're talking about 12 to 16, and I'm just like, that's too much.
Well, it wrecks. The last 2 weeks of this season were really de facto playoff rounds. Of the regular season, and the whole season is basically a big playoff. Maybe a double elimination. You can lose one game, but you can't lose 2 games over the entire season. Where if we go up to 16 teams, it's going to be, there's potentially even 4 lost teams that could make it. Because you'd have conference tie-ins, every conference champion would get in. Then you'd have some at-larges. The only plausible one, I guess, would be the 8-team playoff, where you put all 5 of the major conferences, basically their conference championship games are the first round of the playoffs, because each of those winners then gets the automatic bid. So you'd have 5 automatic bids and then 3 at-larges. I could live with that. I like the 6-team system just because you could reward the number 1 and number 2 teams in the country.
With a bye.
With bye weeks. Then that number 1 and number 2 it tangibly means something. And I think that would be pretty awesome. And again, it could be a playoff committee just like we have now, and they would just determine who's number 1 and number 2. I think this year it's pretty clear, in their rankings at least, that they would put Alabama and Michigan as those number 1 and number 2 teams. I don't think there'd be too much controversy about that. Then you'd have essentially 3 versus 6 and then 4 versus 5. And so you'd have in their setup, it would be Georgia versus Ohio State and Notre Dame versus Cincinnati in the rematch. This goes back to how they can manipulate things. I think they would switch those around. I think they'd move Georgia to number 4. So it'd be Georgia, Notre Dame, and then Cincinnati, Ohio State for the Battle of Ohio. And then the winners of each of those face off against the number 1 and number 2 seeds. So I think that's cool. That only adds 1 week to the whole playoff system too. So I think that's a plausible one. So I think that'd be pretty cool. I guess in our scenario, we'd have Cincinnati and Michigan 1 and 2 with the bye weeks. So we'd have Baylor versus. Do we have Georgia at number 3?
No, number 3? Bama.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we had Bama at number 3. So that'd be a hell of a match. Baylor versus Bama, and then Notre Dame
and Georgia.
So either way, it comes down to a pretty similar thing. But that's where I think that's a fun solution. If everyone's dying for expansion, I'd at least like to slow the rate of expansion, because once we get 6 teams, they're going to want 8 teams. Once we get to 8 teams, they're going to want 12 teams. So I think in incremental steps is the way to, if they're going to expand the playoffs, I think that's the best way to do it. And again, with the end goal of keeping it as small as possible. But I don't know. I think that was a fun exercise. We've done this the whole season long. I think we went through the whole process similar to the way the playoff committee did. You and I had different philosophies, but we kind of stopped butting heads at the end by, we kind of just come up with a consensus. We know how each other thinks. I'm sure those committee members, they didn't have to have really long debates after the first few weeks, because they got to a consensus and they got to a group mindset and a philosophy. So I don't know if that was a window into how the playoff committee may or may not work, but it was fun for us.
There's an interesting note on the final 2 weeks of their rankings. Their rankings, this is the only time this happened. The final 2 weeks were top 6 were exactly the way the BCS computer would have finished them.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, they can look at that. They can look at anything they want, and maybe they just had that computer right there in the room with them as a bit of a guide or as a tiebreaker or something else.
Yeah,
You never know.
the last 2 weeks, it's exactly if they were using the old computer, all the plugging in the different rankings and then the strength of schedule and all that, everything would have been exactly the same. So
Ah, the
so
irony.
now I got to get rid of my bring the computer back because it really is just a bunch of computers in the room.
They just brought the computer in. So,
Yeah, they're just like, well, now the fun's over. Let's see how it should really be. But
you know,
so the
you
computer would have had Alabama at number 1.
interesting. Yeah, I saw the strength of record stuff, and that's some of what they trotted out there to show how Alabama should have been ranked number 1 over Michigan, number 2. I saw the strength of record, strength of schedule, all that stuff, and it was and obviously advantage Alabama. So it's almost like they had that in their back pocket to justify everything or shoot down any arguments. You know, these people aren't paid, I don't believe, for any of this. So it's not like these are elected positions or they're fighting for power or have to justify anything. I think they're just, you know, they've got some financial, you could say, financial ties to this, as they are associated with universities and conferences that profit off of these things. So maybe there could be some, uh, we've talked about the possible corruption or thinking of TV dollars as their part of their decision process. But I think at least this year and the way things worked out, we didn't get the anarchy some of us were hoping for. Things kind of played out the way everyone thought.
Word Hole Media.